They told her they'd try to stay, but minutes before her name was called on stage, her parents walked out. They never heard the speech. They never saw the standing ovation. They missed the moment their daughter stopped waiting to be seen and started standing on her own. What came next left an entire crowd in tears. Subscribe now and hit the like button, because you won't believe how this story ends. Growing up, I used to believe love was quiet, that it came in the form of paying bills, making dinner, or correcting your grammar. My parents weren't cruel, but they were distant, always moving, always working, always making sure everything looked fine. But inside our house, everything felt cold. There were no hugs, no "I'm proud of you," no waiting at the school gates. Just routines, silence, and the constant hum of things left unsaid. I remember one day in second grade, I was chosen to read a poem I wrote in front of the whole school. I practiced for a week. I even wore a dress my aunt had sent from Chicago, hoping my parents would notice. I stood on stage, searching the crowd, rows and rows of parents with cameras, clapping and smiling, but mine weren't there. My teacher gave me a soft pat on the shoulder, said I did great, but the seat they left empty said otherwise. That was the first time I felt invisible, not in a dramatic way, just quietly unimportant. As I grew older, I stopped asking them to come. I stopped showing them the certificates I won or the essays I got praised for. They never really asked anyway. My dad was always exhausted from work. My mom had her book club, her Pilates, her constant stream of text messages. If I ever mentioned something exciting, she'd smile absently and say, "That's great, honey," before moving on. So I found other ways to feel seen. I started writing more short stories, poems, little speeches for class presentations. Whenever I spoke in front of others, I felt like I mattered, like I wasn't just a background character in someone else's life. My classmates started calling me the one who always knows what to say. That stuck with me more than anything my parents ever said. Sometimes I'd wonder what it would feel like to hear them say "good job" or just "we saw you," but I learned not to expect those things. Not everyone gets them. I told myself that happiness and success weren't about applause from your family, they had to come from within. But deep down, I think I always held out a little hope, just a flicker, that maybe one day they'd look up and actually see me. In 8th grade, when I realized I had a thing for public speaking, it started with a history project. Everyone was supposed to create a slideshow about a major event in American history, but instead of standing there reading from slides, I wrote a speech, something simple but with emotion. I practiced it over and over, even timing my pauses. The day I presented, the classroom was unusually quiet. I wasn't used to that kind of attention. At the end, a few students actually clapped. One of them said, "Dang, that sounded like something from a movie." I smiled for the rest of the day. My teacher, Mrs. Callahan, pulled me aside after class. "You have a voice," she said, "a real one. You make people listen without shouting. That's rare." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, but my heart was racing. Someone saw me, not because I was loud or different, just because I said something that mattered. From that day on, I poured myself into anything that involved writing or presenting. I joined the student council, started helping organize assemblies, even entered speech contests. I didn't always win, but every time I stood in front of people, I felt like I was becoming more myself, stronger, more confident. At home, though, nothing changed. I'd mention something I was working on and my dad would barely look up from his phone. "Sounds nice," he'd say, or sometimes just My mom would ask if I remembered to clean my room or if I'd eaten enough vegetables that day. It was like my accomplishments existed in a separate universe from our kitchen table. Once I taped one of my speeches to the fridge just to see if they'd read it. It stayed there for 3 days before my mom threw it away, thinking it was a shopping list or something. I didn't even bother mentioning it. Still, I kept going, not for them, for me, for the girl who used to stand alone on the stage searching for someone in the crowd. I started keeping a little notebook. Every time someone said something kind about one of my speeches, I wrote it down. A teacher's compliment, a classmate's that was actually kinda deep. Those small words became the fuel I didn't know I needed. By the time high school started, I wasn't just the quiet girl anymore. I was that girl who talks like she's already famous. Someone even said I'd be president one day. I laughed, but part of me held on to that, not because I wanted the spotlight, but because it meant I was no longer invisible. At least not to everyone. Sophomore year was when it all cracked open. The school held a regional speech competition and Mrs. Callahan encouraged me to enter. I was nervous. I'd never gone beyond school events, but I said yes. I spent weeks crafting my speech. It was about silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that makes you feel like you're shouting underwater and no one can hear you. I worked on it every night after homework, pacing my room, whispering lines under my breath until they sounded just right. The day of the competition, I wore my best outfit. Nothing fancy, just a blazer I found at a thrift store and my lucky earrings. When I stepped onto that stage in front of 100 strangers, something shifted. I wasn't scared, I was ready. I spoke clearly, slowly, letting the pauses sit. When I finished, the audience was quiet for a beat, then the clapping came, louder than I expected. A judge even stood up. I placed second, not first, but it felt like gold to me. I came home that night holding my certificate like a trophy. My heart was full. I walked into the kitchen where my mom was on her laptop and my dad was scrolling through his phone. "Hey," I said, holding it up. "I won second place at the regional speech finals." My mom looked up for a second and smiled politely. "That's nice, sweetie." My dad just said, "Congrats," and went back to scrolling. No follow-up questions, no hug, no tell me more, just the same distant hum I'd grown up with. I stood there for a moment, then slowly lowered the certificate and went to my room. I sat on my bed and stared at the wall. Why did I even think it would be different? The next day at school, Mrs. Callahan brought in cupcakes to celebrate. The whole class clapped when I walked in. Some even chanted my name like a joke, but in a kind way. I smiled and laughed, pretending everything was perfect, but inside something small had snapped. That night I asked my mom if she could come to the next school event, just one. I said, "It really means a lot to me when people I care about are there." She looked uncomfortable. "We'll see. Your dad's been really stressed with work lately, and I have a fundraiser brunch that day, remember?" I just nodded. I didn't bring it up again. That was the night I wrote in my notebook, "Stop hoping they'll show up, just make sure you do." It hurt, but it was the beginning of something. I realized that waiting for their approval was like waiting for rain in the desert, and maybe, just maybe, I could be my own water. Everything changed the following semester when Mrs. Callahan handed me a flyer. It was for a statewide youth leadership summit, something big, something filled with students from across the state who were doing things that mattered. I looked at the paper, then at her. "You really think I belong there?" She didn't hesitate. "You absolutely belong there." I applied that same night. I wrote an essay about finding your voice when no one seems to be listening. I poured every part of myself into it, the late nights, the ignored victories, the quiet ache of being unseen. When I hit submit, I actually cried a little. I didn't know why at the time. Maybe it was relief, or maybe it was fear that no one would read it, just like everything else I'd tried to share with my parents. A few weeks later, I got the email. I was selected, one of only 20 students in the state. I stared at the screen, not believing it. I wanted to run downstairs and tell someone, anyone, but my parents weren't home. They were at a dinner party. So I texted Mrs. Callahan. I got in. She called me immediately. "I knew it," she yelled. "You're going to be incredible. This is your moment." We spent hours that week planning. She helped me prep for the summit, talking points, my elevator pitch, even little tips on body language. She didn't have to do any of it, but she did, again and again. Like she believed in me in ways I wasn't used to. It made something inside me start to heal. When the day came, she drove me to the venue herself. She waited outside the auditorium doors while I stood in front of strangers, sharing my story, answering questions, listening to others do the same. By the time I left, I felt changed, not because of applause, but because for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who saw me for what I loved, not for what I lacked. Mrs. Callahan took me to lunch afterward. I told her everything I felt, how scared I was at first, how empowered I felt now, how much it meant that she was the one cheering me on. She looked at me and said, "You don't need anyone's permission to be proud of yourself. You just need to remember who you are." I went home that night holding my name badge from the summit like it was a medal. My parents didn't ask where I'd been. I didn't offer to tell them. And strangely, that felt okay. Junior year came with pressure. College talk filled every hallway. GPA, SATs, volunteer hours. It was like we were all sprinting towards something invisible. But while everyone else seemed overwhelmed, I felt ready, like I'd already spent years building my own armor. That fall, I joined the school newspaper. They needed someone to write editorials, pieces that made people feel something. I didn't even hesitate. My first article was about how schools reward loud success but overlook quiet resilience. It was raw and personal. I didn't put my name on it right away. I was afraid. When it came out, students whispered about it between classes. "Did you read that piece in the paper, the one about invisible students?" One girl stopped me in the hallway and said, "That was about me. I think you wrote what I've been trying to say for years." So for the next issue, I put my name on it, fully, no more hiding. The newspaper advisor, Mr. Jenkins, called me into his office. He had tears in his eyes. "That's the kind of writing people remember," he said. "You're not just talented, you're honest. That matters more than anything." That moment, it changed me. I realized that my voice wasn't just something I used on a stage. It could live on paper. It could reach people even when I wasn't in the room. When college scouts visited, one of them actually brought up my article. "You're the writer," he said. "I've heard about you." I didn't even know how to respond. I wasn't used to being someone people recognized for what they created. Meanwhile, at home, everything looked the same. My mom was busy planning a charity gala. My dad had picked up a second consulting job. They were proud of their busyness, of their ability to stay relevant. I told them once that I'd been nominated for a National Teen Journalism Award. My mom smiled and said, "That's wonderful, dear. Don't forget to take out the trash." It wasn't cruel, it was just empty, like cheering with no sound. That night I wrote in my notebook again, "You are not waiting to be chosen. You already chose yourself." That became my new truth. In class, I was called dependable. In the newspaper room, I was called fearless. In my speeches, I was called inspiring. But at home, I was still just the kid who's always writing something. And yet, I no longer needed them to understand it, because piece by piece, I was building something bigger than silence. Senior year arrived faster than I expected. It felt like everything I had been working toward was suddenly in motion: college applications, final exams, scholarship deadlines. And then one morning during homeroom, the announcement came over the loudspeaker: "We are proud to share that the class of this year has selected our senior commencement speaker." There was a pause. I held my breath. Emma Brooks. At first I didn't move. A few kids turned in their seats, then someone clapped, and then more did. My best friend Julia grinned at me across the room and mouthed, "I knew it." I smiled, but inside I was shaking. Not with fear, just the overwhelming realization that everything I had gone through had brought me here. The girl who used to stare at empty seats now had an entire graduating class choosing her to speak on their behalf. That afternoon, Mrs. Callahan hugged me. "They picked the right voice," she whispered. "Now make it count." I went home that night and sat at my desk for hours, staring at a blank page. I didn't want to write something cliché. I wanted to write something real, something that would mean something to the quiet kids, to the ones who felt like background noise, to the ones like me. The first line I wrote was, "Not everyone who graduates here today was ever truly seen." The words poured out after that. I talked about failure, about loneliness, about hidden courage, about the people who show up when it's hard and the people who disappear when it matters most. But more than anything, I wrote about choosing your own value, about refusing to wait for someone else to give you permission to be proud. I didn't tell my parents right away. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to give myself false hope. But a few weeks later, I finally worked up the nerve. We were sitting at the dinner table, quiet like always. I cleared my throat and said, "I was chosen to give the graduation speech." My mom looked up surprised. "Really, that's nice." My dad nodded slowly. "You've always been good at those things." Those things. I tried not to let it bother me. "It's kind of a big deal," I said softly. "There'll be a few hundred people. It's the main speech." My mom nodded. "We'll try to be there. Depends on your dad's client meeting. And I think I have a hair appointment, but I'll reschedule if I can." I just nodded. It was like telling someone you won the lottery, and they asked if you remembered to buy milk. But this time I didn't cry. I didn't beg for their attention. I just went upstairs, opened my laptop, and kept writing. Because this wasn't for them anymore. This was for every version of me who ever stood alone and kept speaking anyway. As the graduation day approached, the weight of it settled deeper in my chest, not fear, just a quiet kind of pressure, like standing on the edge of something you spent years climbing toward. Every spare moment I had, I polished my speech. I rehearsed in front of my mirror in empty classrooms, even during late nights in the kitchen when everyone else was asleep. The day before the ceremony, Mrs. Callahan called me into her classroom. She closed the door and handed me a small envelope. "Open it later," she said, smiling. "But promise me something, don't change a single word of that speech. It's exactly what needs to be heard." That night I sat on my bed and opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "You're not just speaking for them. You're speaking for every student who's ever felt invisible. And you do it beautifully. I'm proud of you." My eyes filled with tears, the kind you don't even try to hold back. It hit me then I wasn't just telling my story. I was holding space for all the quiet voices, all the kids who stayed late at school because no one was home, all the names that never got called in recognition but showed up anyway. This speech wasn't just a milestone, it was a release. The morning of graduation was warm and bright. I stood in front of the mirror in my cap and gown, smoothing down my hair. I looked older somehow, not in my face but in my eyes. I stared at my reflection and whispered, "You're ready." Downstairs, my dad was in his suit, adjusting his watch. My mom was putting on earrings. "We'll head out in a bit," she said. "We want to beat the traffic." For a second, hope stirred in my chest. Maybe they were taking it seriously. Maybe they'd finally be there when it counted. We got to the school early. The gym was already filling up with families, friends, and balloons that bobbed in the warm air like they were celebrating for us. I hugged Julia, found my seat, and tried to steady my breathing. And then, right before the ceremony began, my mom walked over to me holding her phone. "Hey, just so you know, we're going to leave a little early, okay? Your dad has to meet a client in the city, and traffic is getting bad already." I blinked. "Wait, what? You're leaving before my speech?" She gave a tight smile. "You'll do great, sweetie. We've been to so many school things over the years." I didn't say anything, I just nodded slowly. I felt the heat rising in my chest, but I didn't cry, I didn't plead. Because I already knew. They weren't staying. And still I sat back down, I breathed, I held on to everything I had become. Because even if they missed it, I wouldn't. When they called my name to come to the podium, something in me detached, like my body stood up before my mind could catch up. I heard the applause, saw my classmates clapping and smiling, some cheering louder than I expected, but I couldn't find the two faces I kept scanning for. The seats where my parents had been were now empty. I took a deep breath and climbed the steps, each one feeling like its own little goodbye. I placed my speech on the podium, looked out over the crowd, and for a brief second, panic flickered in my chest. Not because of stage fright, I wasn't afraid of the crowd. I was afraid that the moment I'd been building toward was already broken, that the people I had most wanted to prove myself to had walked away before I could even begin. But then from the front row, Julia gave me a tiny thumbs up. One of my teachers nodded with quiet encouragement. I spotted Mrs. Callahan near the back, standing. That was enough. That had to be enough. So I took a breath, and I spoke. I've spent most of my life learning how to be small, not because anyone told me to, but because sometimes when no one notices you, you begin to shrink without realizing it. You stop raising your hand, you stop sharing your voice, you convince yourself you don't need to be seen to be valuable. I saw people shift forward in their seats. The silence was full, not empty, but listening. But this year something changed. I realized that being small didn't protect me, it only hid the parts of me that were most worth sharing. So today I speak not because I finally feel ready, but because I finally feel worthy. I talked about fear, about being overlooked, about how easy it is to carry other people's silence like your own. I talked about the people who did show up and how their presence became the foundation I stood on now. When I reached the final line, "If you're waiting for someone to clap for you, clap first," I paused. And then it happened. Someone stood up. Then another and another. Within seconds, the whole crowd was on their feet. A standing ovation, not polite, not out of obligation, it was real and overwhelming. I blinked hard, my vision blurred. In that moment, I didn't think about the empty seats. I thought about the notebook full of kind words, the long nights, the whispers to myself in the mirror, the girl who once taped a speech to the fridge hoping someone would read it. This was for her. This was for all of us. After the ceremony ended, I stood near the bleachers with my diploma in one hand and my speech folded in the other. People kept coming up to me, teachers, students I barely knew, even parents from other families. They all had something to say. "You made me cry." That was the most honest speech I've ever heard. "My daughter Espen's struggling, and I think you gave her something today." Each word felt like a drop of warmth sinking into places I didn't even realize were cold. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled, nodded, said thank you over and over. It didn't feel real. None of it did. Mrs. Callahan was the last to find me. She pulled me into a hug before I could even speak. "You owned that moment," she whispered. "You were bigger than the silence." I hugged her tighter than I meant to. She didn't let go right away. Julia snapped a picture of us, then another of me holding my diploma. "You look like someone who finally knows who she is," she said. And maybe I did. We walked out to the parking lot together and I checked my phone, half expecting a message. Maybe something from my mom, a text that said sorry we missed it, or even just how did it go. Nothing. I stared at the blank screen for a few seconds, then quietly slipped it back into my pocket. "Wanna come to dinner with us?" Julia asked. Her parents were taking her out to celebrate, and they had already told her to invite me too. For a second I hesitated. I thought maybe I should go home. Maybe they'd be waiting. Maybe they'd surprise me. But then I remembered the way my mom had said, "We've been to so many school things." So I looked at Julia and said, "Yeah, I'd love that." At the restaurant, her parents toasted to both of us. Her mom said, "Your speech gave me chills." Her dad added, "I hope you know how important it was." I didn't cry, but something loosened in me, something I'd been holding on to for too long, a small knot of waiting, of needing. It started to dissolve. That night I went home, changed into pajamas and climbed into bed. The house was quiet, no note, no mention of anything, just the same hum of ordinary life. But I wasn't the same. And I never would be again. The morning after graduation, I woke up to the sun pouring through my curtains and the soft thud of my mom moving around downstairs. I sat up slowly, half expecting to find a card on my nightstand, or a note, or anything. There was nothing. I walked into the kitchen, still in my oversized hoodie, and found my parents already halfway through breakfast. My dad was reading something on his tablet. My mom was stirring her coffee. "Morning," I said quietly. They both responded in sync, like a reflex. "Morning." A pause. "So how did it go?" my mom asked, glancing up. I blinked at the speech. She nodded. "Yeah, did people like it?" I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just said, "Yeah." They stood up. My dad looked over his glasses. "What do you mean, like a standing ovation?" I nodded. He raised his eyebrows and nodded once. "Huh, that's great." My mom smiled vaguely. "Well, I'm sure you did fine. You've always been good at that public speaking stuff." That public speaking stuff. I poured myself a glass of orange juice and sat down across from them. For a minute I watched them, realizing I was no longer angry, just tired. Tired of hoping they'd catch up to the version of me that existed outside this house. Later that afternoon, Julia texted me a photo, me on stage, arms spread slightly, smiling through the blur of tears. The whole crowd behind me standing. She decaptured it at just the right moment. She wrote, "I hope you never forget this." I set it as my phone background. In the days that followed, something inside me shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like the changing of a season. I stopped checking for texts from my parents when something good happened. I stopped mentally writing scripts in my head for how I'd explain my feelings to them. I just accepted it. They were who they were, and I didn't need to spend the rest of my life auditioning for their love. Instead, I sent my writing portfolio to a summer mentorship program. I wrote a letter of thanks to Mrs. Callahan. I started drafting personal essays for my college applications, not about awards or grades, but about that moment on stage, the one no one in my family saw, but which defined me all the same. I began to trust something I hadn't before, my own voice, my ability to move people, to create light in rooms where I'd once felt invisible. They missed the standing ovation. But I didn't. College acceptance letters came in waves. I lined them up on my desk like trophies, each one a quiet echo of the girl who once taped a speech to the fridge, hoping someone would notice. I got into my top choice, a university with a strong communications program and a scholarship that covered most of the tuition. When I told my parents, they were polite, surprised even. "Wow," my mom said, "that's a big deal." My dad added, "Good for you." There was no celebration, no dinner out, just a nod and a return to their usual rhythm. But I didn't take it personally anymore. I didn't need their enthusiasm to validate my own joy. Instead, I threw a little celebration at the park with Julia and a few close friends. We sat under string lights, ordered pizza, and toasted with soda bottles. They brought cards, tiny gifts, hugs that actually meant something. At some point, Julia pulled me aside. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded. "Do you think they even realize what they missed?" I shrugged, maybe one day, maybe not. She looked at me for a second, then said, "Well, I saw it, I see you, always have." And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, relief, the kind that comes from knowing you don't have to carry the weight of old wounds alone. That summer, I volunteered at a writing camp for younger students. One afternoon, a girl named Lexi, 12, quiet, barely spoke, handed me a poem. She whispered, "It's about not feeling good enough." I read it. It broke my heart. Then I smiled at her and said, "You're better than good enough. You're brave." Her eyes filled with tears. She smiled back. Later that night, I realized something. I was becoming the person I'd needed when I was her age. And that, more than college, more than awards, was the kind of success that mattered to me now. My parents hadn't changed, maybe they never would. But I had. And in becoming fully myself, I was finally free. The night before I left for college, I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by boxes, half-packed and marked with Sharpie. Books, notebooks, old trophies, and folded-up speeches I hadn't had the heart to throw away. I picked up the one from graduation, unfolded it, and read it aloud to myself in a whisper. I still remembered the pauses, the weight of certain words. I remembered the silence that came before the applause. I walked through the house once more before bed. The living room looked the same. My parents were watching TV, the same show they always watched. My mom looked up briefly and asked, "You all packed?" "Almost," I said. There was a pause, and then she added, "We're proud of you." It should have meant something. Maybe years ago, it would have knocked the air out of me. But now it just felt like punctuation, late but still appreciated. I smiled politely, "Thanks." The next morning, they hugged me goodbye at the curb. My dad told me to call if I needed anything. My mom said, "Don't forget to eat well." And then I got in the car with my friend Julia, who was driving me to campus. As the city shrank in the rearview mirror, I didn't feel sadness. I felt space, like I was finally stepping into my own voice without having to make it small for someone else's comfort. College was loud and fast and overwhelming at first, but I adjusted. I joined the university newspaper. I started a podcast about unheard stories. I gave another speech at orientation, this time to hundreds of freshmen. They cheered, a few even cried. I got emails afterward from students saying, "Thank you for saying the thing I didn't know how to say." I kept Lexi's poem in my planner. I still emailed Mrs. Callahan once a month, and every time I stood on a stage or hit publish on something I wrote, I thought about the girl who once stared into an empty crowd and spoke anyway. Not for applause, not for approval, but because her voice was worth hearing. Even if the people she wanted to hear it never stayed long enough to listen. So if you're still waiting for someone to show up for you, maybe it's time to show up for yourself. Because you never know who's sitting in that crowd needing to hear your truth. And when you speak it, they just might stand up.